You are going to see how John chapter 17 verse 3 proves Jesus is God. And there's 5 things John does to show this. Before I show you these 5 things though, let's read the verse and I'll show you why people think this verse shows that Jesus is not God. Jesus says in John chapter 17 verse 3, "And this is life eternal, that they might know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Some read this and think, because Jesus called his Father the only true God, he cannot be the only true God. That may be true if John quoted Jesus as saying, "You alone are the only true God," but that's not what John wrote. And this is not what John means by writing this in his gospel. Christians believe that the Father is the only true God, and we also believe Jesus is the only true God. This is what John wants you to believe as well. So let's go through the 5 ways John shows you Jesus is also the only true God. The first is the hardest to understand. I promise it will be like riding down a hill though, with the wind pushing you forward for the other 4. In this verse, John distinguishes Jesus from eternal life and the only true God. In this verse, John writes that eternal life is to know the only true God and Jesus, but John also writes that Jesus is eternal life, which I'll show you later on in the video. If Jesus is eternal life, even though distinguished from it, it doesn't stop Jesus from being eternal life, does it? And why wouldn't the same apply for Jesus being the only true God? Because John calls Jesus the only true God as well. This cannot mean Jesus meant the only true God was the Father in a way that excludes himself or the Spirit. Let's start moving downhill now. Point number 2 is the immediate context of the passage. By reading verses 1 to 5, it is clear Jesus shares God's glory from eternity. In eternity, Jesus was with the Father, sharing his glory. In John 17 verse 1, Jesus asks for the Father to glorify the Son, so the Son can glorify the Father. In verse 5, Jesus says the Father should glorify him again with the glory they had in eternity. And God does not share this type of glory with anyone. So Jesus is God if he can share in this glory. It is important to remember Jesus is speaking here from earth. He wants to return to former glory before entering his creation. Point number 3 shows this when you look at the broader context of what's actually going on here. And you can do this by looking at John chapter 13 through to John chapter 17. This covers the Last Supper with the disciples, and this helps us understand what John is doing here. John describes a wonderful visual illustration. This shows us what John has been saying from the start of the gospel. God has entered into his creation to save it and then is leaving. John does this by writing, Jesus was thinking about leaving earth. When thinking about this, Jesus took off his expensive clothes. He then put on a towel and washed his disciples' feet. This symbolizes servanthood. Peter doesn't understand, like we often don't understand what God is doing. But after finishing, John chapter 13 verse 12 describes the end. Jesus then puts back on his expensive clothing and sat down again. And by John writing what was on Jesus' mind, and with one visual illustration, John shows us how Jesus is God and what his mission was. The king enters his creation, disrobes and behaves like a servant, and then puts his robe back on and sits on the throne again. This is giving me goosebumps, but it shows the love God has for you and for me. But shows you why Jesus in John 17 verse 5 wants to go back to that glory. He left that glory because of his love for you. How can you not serve God when he loves you so much? And this shouldn't be surprising. That visual illustration only makes sense because of how John starts the gospel. John starts showing Jesus is the eternal Word who was with God, who was God, but entered creation to save mankind. To understand John 17:3, read John chapter 1 verse 1 to 11. Now if all this is not enough, point 5 is the icing on the cake. Remember I said earlier, John also writes that Jesus is eternal life and the only true God. You can see this by reading 1 John. In 1 John chapter 1 verse 1 to 2 it says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word of life. For the life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness, and show unto you that eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested unto us." And then it goes on to say in verse 3, John wants to share it with you. Eternal life was seen in the flesh, John says. And you know that he's speaking about Jesus. But it gets better. That's how he starts the letter, but how he ends the letter is greater. In 1 John chapter 5 verse 20, John writes, "And we know that the Son of God is come and has given us an understanding that we may know him that is true, and we are in him that is true, in his Son Jesus Christ. This is the true God and eternal life. John starts the same way he ends, only this time he not only calls Jesus eternal life, but the true God too. These 5 points show Jesus is God in John chapter 17:3. Thank you for watching. See you next time. God bless.